Manish Mehta here alongside Seth Walder and Gary Myers. The Daily News has compiled a list of the top 10 players in Jets history. And Gary, when you talk about this franchise and which player should be atop that list, I don't think there can be any doubt that it starts and ends with Joe Namath.
Well, basically because of one season and one game,
Right.
Maybe the most important game in NFL history, Super Bowl III, the Jets beat the Colts. But, when people put into perspective Joe Namath's career, they forget it was only one season in his career, Manish, that he threw more touchdowns than interceptions. But all people want to remember is Super Bowl III, and rightfully so.
Right, and look, he had the bravado, a guy from Western Pennsylvania, but it was almost like he was born to play in New York with all of the nightlife, the women, and the penchant for big plays in those big moments you talked about.
And just because of Joe, you wear pantyhose, don't you?
No comment. Statistically, though, look, in 1967, he did become the first player in NFL history to pass for 4,000 yards. That was in a 14-game season,
right.
Yeah, so that tells you how dynamic he was through the air, at least in spurts. And I think when you talk about this franchise, they have not delivered the ultimate prize since that moment when the Jets and Namath beat the Colts. So that's why Joe Namath is such a prominent figure with this franchise, even almost 5 decades later.
Well, yeah, and again, deservedly so,
Yeah.
because he put the Jets on the map. He put the AFL on the map with that one game. So again, although Joe did not have a career like some of the other Hall of Fame quarterbacks have had, he does deserve to be in the Hall of Fame, and he does deserve to be number one on our list of all-time Jets.
Of course, he's the face of the franchise. Let's go down the list here. Number 2, Don Maynard, another member of the Hall of Fame, probably a little bit overshadowed because Joe Namath was on his team. But what do you remember about Maynard's exploits?
Well, just, great hands, a great go-to receiver for Joe, and, combined with George Sauer, probably, the best 1-2 receiving combination in Jets history, and they've had a few good ones.
Right, and I know that fantasy football owners might not think this is impressive, but Maynard had 5 consecutive seasons with 50 receptions and 1,000 yards. For that time, in that era, that was pretty impressive. And also, Maynard retired in 1973, to keep this in perspective, Gary, as the leading receiver in NFL history,
Right.
the most receptions and yards. Again, that tells you a little bit about what kind of player he was for that team during that era. Let's go to a little bit of more modern players, Seth. Curtis Martin, recently inducted to the Hall of Fame. Everyone thinks of Curtis Martin as the clear-cut best running back in franchise history. What stood out for you when you look back on his career?
Well, the interesting thing first, he didn't start with the Jets. He started with the division rival New England Patriots. Took a bold move by Bill Parcells to bring him over, but it paid off in a big way. 7 of 8 seasons with the Jets, over 1,000 yards. And he led the league in rushing at age 31. That's incredibly impressive.
Right, and Bill Parcells, obviously, and deservedly so, gets a lot of credit for bringing Curtis Martin to the Jets. But the architect for that deal was Mike Tannenbaum, who worked out with Eugene Parker, Curtis Martin's agent, really an intricate and creative deal that made it nearly impossible for the Patriots to match. And the other thing that stands out, Gary, for me, and Curtis Martin probably more than anyone else at our newspaper, was that at the age of 31, he led the NFL in rushing.
Yeah, like Seth just mentioned, that was incredible. He's also, along with Barry Sanders, the only running backs in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards in each of his first 10 seasons. He's the 4th leading rusher in NFL history, and that tends to get lost because he wasn't flashy. He didn't have a lot of those 65-yard runs, but he was not like a record compiler. He didn't play 15 years to get to be the 4th leading rusher in NFL history. He was consistently great without being flashy every year of his career until he was hurt towards the end.
Right, and no list of Jets players would be complete without a couple members of the New York Stock Exchange. Chiming in at number 4 on our list is Joe Klecko. Not as flashy as Mark Gastineau, who's number 6 on our list, but Joe Klecko was one of the most versatile players of his time.
And, as a voting member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, I've been trying to get support going for Joe to get into the Hall of Fame. And, Seth, you might not know this, but, being that you're about 12 years old, he's the only player in NFL history to make the Pro Bowl at 3 different positions: defensive end, defensive tackle, and nose tackle. And now, he was up for the Hall of Fame for a number of years, and now he's only eligible as a senior, and it's going to be hard for him to get in because there's a lot of players, that the senior committee has to now consider, and Joe, not being one of the older guys, being eligible for a senior committee, he's probably have to wait for a while. I'm really disappointed that when he was a modern era candidate, that Joe did not get into the Hall of Fame.
Right, and I agree with you. If you watched football in the early to mid 80s, it'd be hard pressed to find an offensive, a defensive line, that was as dominant and as versatile as Joe Klecko. An interesting note about Joe Klecko, he led the NFL in sacks, 20.5 sacks in 1981. Unfortunately, that was the year before sack became an official statistic. And now, maybe our favorite Jet on this list, number 5, certainly Woody Johnson's favorite guy on this list. Darrelle Revis chimes in at number 5. Again, we know about what has happened over the last couple of years with Revis and the organization. Gary, I think the most interesting question is, clearly he deserves to be a top 10 player in franchise history. How do you think he would have fared on this list if he was still a Jet and if he remained a Jet for the entirety of his career?
Well, if you take that assumption and say it was reality and he played at the same level, say for 10 years as he did for 6 years, I think clearly, Seth, you might agree with this, that he would have been second on the list. Behind Namath.
I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, an elite corner, arguably the greatest corner of all time. You maintain that level with the Jets for 10 seasons, that would be incredible.
Yeah, he really brought back the term shutdown cornerback, really the best cornerback that I've seen in my lifetime other than Deion Sanders. I'll take Sanders still because of pure athleticism over Darrelle Revis.
Well, the difference between those two, I think, and which brings Revis probably even with Sanders, Sanders was probably the best cover corner of all time. Right. But Revis is a more complete player because he actually tackles people, which Sanders didn't do. Now, Sanders might say, well, nobody ever caught a ball on me, so there's no need to tackle. But, Darrelle is good coming up in run protection. And the reason that I think we would say he's one of our favorite Jets of all time is because for a newspaper guy, he created more headlines for us, and that's what this business is all about. So we do miss Darrelle here for that very reason.
Right, and 2009 was as dominant a season I've ever seen a cornerback have, moving around the field, shutting down Andre Johnson, Calvin Johnson, you name it. Every great wide receiver that the Jets faced that year did virtually nothing because of Darrelle Revis. And I think he probably should have been Defensive Player of the Year. Charles Woodson with Green Bay at the time won the award. But Rex Ryan, I remember, and I know you guys remember as well, was really stumping for Revis to be MVP virtually every week that season.
Which probably led to Darrelle's holdout the next year, using everything.
Bad move by Rex.
Using everything Rex said, in trying to get a new contract.
Right, and number 6 on the list, we mentioned him earlier, Mark Gastineau, probably the most flamboyant guy other than Joe Namath on that list. Gary, you saw him play. What stood out from you other than that sack dance, of course?
Well, just that he was, prolific getting to the quarterback. Right. I wouldn't say he was the most popular player in the room because, he was all about Mark.
Right.
But he was a productive player. A lot of people remember for a big penalty he had in a overtime playoff loss against the Cleveland Browns in '86 when, the Jets had a really good chance to advance in the playoffs. But, Mark probably the best pass rusher in team history.
Right, and number 7, we don't neglect the offensive lineman here, Winston, who started 174 consecutive games, an anchor for Joe Namath during that Super Bowl season, chimes in at number 7. Number 8, our second running back, really the best running back in franchise history until Curtis Martin came along. That was Freeman McNeil, Seth.
That's right. McNeil, like you mentioned, led the Jets in rushing until Martin came along. He was an impressive rusher. It was unfortunate the injuries cut his career a little bit short, but he averaged 4.5 yards per carry over the course of his career, and that is remarkable.
Yeah, and never at any point in any single season did he average fewer than 4 yards. But 4.5 yards a carry for a career, Gary, that's certainly impressive.
That's pretty good. And again, in 1981 when he was drafted, the pick right after Lawrence Taylor. So both New York teams got real impact players in that '81 draft.
Right, and rounding out the top 10, Larry Grantham from 1960 to 1972, a guy, Gary, sometimes gets overlooked, because of the passage of time, but pretty solid linebacker. Difficult, statistically to determine what his impact was, but I think if you talk to old-timers, people that were around, he clearly deserves to be on this list.
Yeah, and he was really the heart and soul of that Super Bowl defensive team in the 1968 season. And, I'm glad that all of us who voted, recognized Grantham because, he did play a long time ago, and obviously, being a linebacker, he wasn't quite as flashy as some of the other players on our list, but certainly deserving.
And rounding out the top 10, Wesley Walker, deep threat, wide receiver. Statistically, again, it's tough to measure his numbers to the guys now in the league because of the rules and because of the difference in how the game is played, but clearly a deserving candidate as well.
Right, and the greatest home run hitter in Jets history. I would say that if Wesley was playing today with the rules in the NFL where you basically can't breathe on a receiver anymore, that he'd be good for 1,600 yards and 12 touchdowns every year.
Right, and Gary, I know how you love these lists. There's always a lot of debate here. We left out a couple deserving people. Anybody stand out maybe that was deserving to be in this top 10 for us?
Well, I think if you go with a 10A perhaps on this list, it would be Marvin Powell, a left tackle for the Jets who made, I think, 5 Pro Bowls and first team All-Pro a couple of times. You know, you can probably find a spot for him on this team.
Yeah,
well.
I agree. And Hank Gola was jockeying to get him in the top 10. I'm sorry,
well,
I had to
stick up for
That's
him.
right. I had to veto him. And I will say this as my bold prediction as we end this video: in 10 years, both Mo Wilkerson and Sheldon Richardson will be on this top 10 list.
And I will predict that you'll be standing here right now doing that list.
All right, for Gary Myers, Seth Walder, I'm Manish Mehta. Make sure to check out our season preview on nydailynews.com.